If you'd like, it'd be great if you could just tell us a little bit more about your ties to the Valley and what makes the Valley a special place for you.
So I was in my teen years, in my 20s, and I was making a lot of money, but the values in that corporate world were really in direct conflict with how I was raised. To have family at the center, to have traditions, to have celebrations in the church, to focus a life very kind of like this altruistic life where you're living for your larger family group and doing better for your family, right? Because the culture is very, I think, family centric, and even though there's communities where the ethnic groups are concentrated, it's still very like this extended family, pods in Antonito. Like there'll be the Trio family, the Romero family, it's very by family, and in the corporate setting, there were so many projects they did that all it mattered was how inexpensive it was for the corporate entity. It didn't matter that we were discharging so much salt into these municipal entities that didn't have the wastewater treatment facilities to get it out of there. And then you think of the health impacts from salt, like high blood pressure and heart disease, and it began to just wear on me emotionally. My parents were raised in the community where I grew up. My dad is originally from Antonito and my mom's from Ortiz. So all the outlying villages of Antonito, they kind of came into school in the, probably in the 50s, like the early 50s when the nuns ran the school. And I think I grew up, I went to school, kind of had a different value set. I wasn't able to qualify how I was raised or why it was important to me to be connected and rooted here are my kids. But I think in moving around and in living different places, I realized how unique it is in the San Luis Valley and in my hometown, and you recognize some of the links to global struggles and recognize that we're kind of a unique, isolated cultural group, which I wasn't able to qualify because it was the majority culture in my community. So what makes me tied to it now, I think, is it's a culmination of my life experience and coming back full circle to what I was taught that was valuable for me as an individual, but wasn't able to qualify that until now that I'm an adult. I left the Valley for college when I was 17. I went to school in Golden at School of Mines. Advanced degrees are very valued because I think it was ingrained that education was a social equalizer, even though it wasn't verbalized that way. That was clearly the message. Like, do well in school, get out of here. Success was very tied to leaving the community versus staying back and building it and contributing. And that's not where I am now. I think that recognizing that uniqueness and the sense of place and how rare that is in sort of these, these migrations of so many cultures, and how people in the San Luis Valley, especially the Hispanos, they haven't become part of that melting pot that is like mainstream culture in the U.S., and that's very unique, I think, to this region. And it's valuable, and I think it's a value to just acculturate and be able to function in your own culture and in mainstream culture, but I don't think that everybody needs to assimilate, and I think people in the Valley have not. That pivotal moment came when I moved back home, and this waste was coming through town, and people were really upset. Like, people were afraid. My older sister was really, really afraid, and just seeing people in the community asking very common sense questions and being talked down to or belittled, it was very frustrating. And so my plan then was, okay, let me incorporate this entity so people could sue. We started this organization, and there just seemed to be a different need every turn. And it became to a point where I couldn't walk away from it because of this sort of structure that was built and all these partnerships that are regional, and the different work we're doing from getting a study to make sure if radioactive, hazardous, toxic waste does come through, there has to be a NEPA process for that site, to getting like a community solar garden built, the first one and only one in the San Luis Valley, to getting air, soil, water, health baseline data collected, to like now we're working on recycling. And then this other opportunity, again out of need, came with this targeted hire for Antonito. And a lot of rural communities are struggling with how do you keep in compliance with sort of regulatory framework when you have aging infrastructure, when you have no capacity, when you have limited resources, when you have like just brilliant people running things but for free. You know, there's not paid staff, and the staff that are paid live below the federal poverty level. So it's just it becomes this sort of, well, you have to be creative in finding these solutions, and I realize that's something unique that I have. And it's being ingrained so much, like you have to give back with your gifts and you have to give back to your family. It seems like a moral and ethical obligation, but it's also a passion, because there's not that conflict like that existed in the corporate entity where the work I'm doing isn't aligned with my personal values. In the waste issue, there was these task force discussions that he's a former congressman. He just retired, or he just resigned as the state ag secretary. He formed this task force to try to find resolution. And in that task force, there was representatives from the railroad, there was representatives from the entity that was cleaning up in Los Alamos, Energy Solutions, the railroad here, the SLNRG, representatives from the lab, from Los Alamos, from the Department of Energy, because the lab is a Department of Energy facility. And then, so they each had 2 representatives. So there was 10 people there, and then there was 3 of us from the community. So it was, at the time, my brother was Mayor Mike, then Joe Mestis was a former commissioner, he was there, then Olive Valdez was there, and then there were 13 of us. They had asked that I go on the task force because of my background in engineering and working with corporations, and they felt comfortable with me there. So then I came on, so that I was the 4th person from like talking on behalf of the community in those discussions. At the time we were talking to attorneys, and it was just a very complicated situation. It was 2 different federal levels, a state level, and then a local land use conflict at all 4 levels, right? And just what was repeatedly told to us was in those discussions, well, you have no chance. The railroad has this sort of preemptive authority. There's a 99.9% chance, always kind of trying to extort this agreement out of us on behalf of the community. And the attorneys were just saying, just gather information, go in there and don't really, you know, if they're willing to remove, because at the time the railroad was suing the county for its authority before the Surface Transportation Board, and the highway access permit had just been granted, and so they were kind of telling us, well, you are going to lose, so just get protection through the settlement agreement. And we're like, well, how many people are going to be hurt by this? Like, what are the impacts? Like, and no straight answers. And their own internal documents said there would be 8 deaths along the course of the cleanup. And like, well, are those 8 deaths all in Antonito, since you're parking this waste right in our community? Or like, where, like, what is going on here? And I think it was the only time I've ever been treated like I was really, really ignorant and ill-informed, and just like I didn't matter, or the voice of people that I was speaking for in those discussions didn't matter. And it was communicated very directly sometimes, like, well, this place is so shitty anyway, what do you care if one more thing comes through? And it's like, well, those are our struggles over generations, because of land loss, because of unique land tenure, because of language loss, because those are our struggles. Like, who are you to come in and say, well, I'm here now, I make the rules? It was very humbling and humiliating. So that was what I felt in those discussions, and that was what I was feeling the community members were feeling when I first came home. That sort of frustration and disempowerment, and it was just too much to not help. It was so long, that final, like when we got the settlement from the lawsuit, we knew it was over, but the Surface Transportation Board ruling was still out, which it didn't matter if the Surface Transportation Board had granted them preemption, because they would have had to do the NEPA analysis. So when the railroad ruling came out, and the railroad, so the Surface Transportation Board, this is the only time they've ever left Washington, D.C. to hear public testimony, but they came to Conejos, and there was like 90 people that testified. I think only 5 people spoke in support, everybody else spoke in opposition. And the folks that spoke in support were from the companies, the railroad, and one guy who had just moved into Alamosa to talk about economic development. And in our communities, so many times as I'm on this whole environmental justice movement now, that's the choice we're forced to make: health or providing for family. So when we got that decision that the Surface Transportation Board had dismissed their petition, like all those discussions, like 99.99% sure that the railroad's gonna get preemption, like this place is so shitty, you guys should just, what was just one more thing, and it was just a moment of like we did it, like we got the protections for the community. It was, but then you realize that those impacts are still in another community, like that waste is still going through another community, and it fuels the work when you recognize, well, there shouldn't be any communities that are burdened. Like Marian Naranjo, who was working with us on that from Santa Clara Pueblo, the lab is built on her ancestral lands, you know what I mean? And it's a whole movement, and it's nice to have solidarity in that movement, but it was like a moment of disbelief, a moment of glory, a moment of sadness. Like it can never just be one thing.